He was the county sheriff, an individual entrusted to uphold the law. Yet, in the shadows, he perpetrated the ultimate treachery, slaying his wife to safeguard a dominion built on deceit. The investigation exposed a man who operated above the law, a predator concealed behind a badge, convinced his authority rendered him untouchable. But the sheriff, who dared to mock the prosecutor, was soon to confront a stark reality. His destiny hinged on a singular witness, the one person he believed would forever shield his secrets. His own partner would ultimately testify against him. How does a man cloaked in the mantle of honor employ it to veil a heart of profound darkness? This chilling query would reverberate through the very foundations of law enforcement in Travis County. A question birthed from a solitary, brutal act of violence. It was an incident that demonstrated with stark clarity that the most insidious evil can fester in the most trusted precincts. The truth, when it finally surfaced, would not merely resolve a murder, but would dismantle a dynasty founded on deception and irrevocably erode the public's trust in those sworn to protect them. The crime scene was situated within a sprawling ranch-style residence in Austin, Texas's affluent suburbs, a property befitting the standing of its proprietor, Sheriff Michael Snyder. This metropolis, a burgeoning tech-savvy hub that prides itself on its eccentricity, was about to confront a horror that was tragically commonplace. Beneath the veneer of progressive culture and artistic expression, the ancient evils of avarice and betrayal thrived with a particular malevolence. On this particular night, in a home intended as a sanctuary, that evil would manifest in a flurry of gunfire and the spilling of innocent blood. Claire Snyder had endured the final 6 months of her life navigating a nightmare meticulously woven by the man she loved. She had unearthed a vast and intricate web of financial chicanery, a scheme orchestrated by her husband, Michael, to siphon millions from the county and from private investors who had placed their implicit trust in him. Claire, a painstaking accountant by profession, had discovered the concealed ledgers, the offshore accounts, an irrefutable proof of a life constructed upon a bedrock of pure corruption. She had confronted Michael, issuing an ultimatum: surrender himself, or she would present the district attorney with every piece of evidence she had amassed. That confrontation sealed her fate, initiating a chain of events that would culminate in tragedy. Michael Snyder, a man who perceived the law not as a set of regulations to adhere to, but as an instrument to be manipulated, made a cold and calculated decision. He could not permit his empire to collapse, his reputation to be irrevocated, or his liberty to be seized. On a balmy Texas evening, as the sun descended over the undulating hills, he entered his home office where Claire was meticulously organizing the final fragments of evidence and, without a moment of hesitation, ended her life. The initial 911 call was a masterclass performance of sorrow and bewilderment, a testament to Michael's decades of practice in deception. He informed the dispatcher that he had just returned home from a late-night engagement to discover his wife deceased, seemingly the victim of a home invasion gone terribly awry. His voice was thick with feigned anguish, his words meticulously chosen to portray a heartbroken husband stumbling upon an unimaginable horror. He established his alibi, alluded to a fictitious, suspicious vehicle he had allegedly observed, and flawlessly enacted the role of the grieving victim, fully aware that the first officers to arrive would be his own deputies, men he had trained and commanded for over 10 years. Detective Walter Hughes of the Austin Police Department was assigned the case, a decision that immediately generated friction with the sheriff's office. Hughes was a seasoned officer, a man with a deep-seated suspicion of those who wielded power too comfortably, and he sensed an inherent wrongness from the moment he stepped onto the property. The scene felt orchestrated too pristine in certain areas, yet too disheveled in others, and the sheriff's demeanor struck him as theatrical rather than genuinely distraught. While Michael's deputies were quick to accept his narrative, Hughes perceived not a mourning husband, but a self-assured predator who believed he had executed the perfect crime. The atmosphere in Austin was one of shock and utter disbelief, a city grappling with the notion that the wife of their top law enforcement officer could be murdered in her own abode. Local news channels propagated the botched burglary story, portraying Michael Snyder as a tragic figure, a dedicated public servant whose family had been senselessly targeted. This narrative, meticulously crafted by Michael himself, preyed upon the public's fears and their intrinsic trust in his office. Beneath the surface of this booming, tech-savvy city that prides itself on being unconventional, the conventional evil of a man murdering his wife was being obscured by the very institution designed to combat it. Claire Snyder was more than simply a victim. She was a woman of unwavering integrity and quiet fortitude. Friends and family would later characterize her as the moral compass of the Snyder family, a gentle yet resolute presence who had grown increasingly troubled by her husband's arrogance and his relentless pursuit of wealth and status. She had endeavored, in her own subtle manner, to guide him back to the righteous path. Nevertheless, she had come to the somber realization that the man she married had long since been supplanted by a monster. Her decision to expose him was not an act of vengeance, but an act of profound civic duty, a final, desperate attempt to prevent the man she once adored from inflicting any further harm. Michael's partner, Deputy Mark Mitchell, was among the first to reach the scene. He had served alongside Michael for 15 years, viewing him as both a mentor and a friend, and initially, his loyalty blinded him. He assisted in securing the scene, consoled his superior, and relayed the sheriff's account to the other officers, never once questioning the narrative presented to him. Yet, even in those nascent hours, a nascent seed of doubt began to germinate in his mind, sown by the cold, almost analytical manner in which Michael recounted the discovery of his wife's body, a detail that would later blossom into a dense forest of suspicion. The investigation into the financial crimes that Claire had unearthed was just beginning to take shape in the shadows. A small, dedicated team within the district attorney's office had been collaborating with a confidential informant, Claire Snyder herself, for weeks, meticulously constructing a case they knew would be explosive. Her murder was not merely a tragedy. It was a direct assault on the justice system itself. They knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that her killer was not some random burglar, but the very man who was now standing before news cameras, vowing to bring his wife's slayer to justice. The crime scene itself held the keys that would ultimately unravel Michael's carefully constructed story. While he had been meticulous, he had made mistakes, minor moments of arrogance that would ultimately betray him. He had repositioned a piece of furniture to simulate a more convincing struggle, but in doing so, he had left a perfect shoe print in a thin layer of dust. He had wiped down the murder weapon, but had neglected the spare magazine in his pocket, which would later be found to bear his fingerprints. Each error was a chink in the armor of the perfect crime, a testament to the chilling fact that his unwavering belief in his own superiority was his greatest vulnerability. As the initial night of the investigation unfolded, the city of Austin mourned the loss of a prominent citizen, utterly oblivious to the sinister truth lurking just beneath the surface. The city, which prided itself on its unconventional and forward-thinking identity, was now the backdrop for a story as ancient as time, a narrative of greed, betrayal, and a powerful man who genuinely believed he could evade justice for murder. The stage was set for a protracted battle between a corrupt sheriff and the handful of determined individuals who were prepared to risk everything to ensure he was held accountable for his transgressions. The path to justice would prove to be arduous and fraught with intimidation and legal maneuvering, but it commenced here, in a silent house permeated by the echoes of a final, fatal confrontation. The apprehension of Sheriff Michael Snyder was not a swift event. It culminated after 3 weeks of painstaking covert investigation, spearheaded by Detective Walter Hughes. Hughes and his team were compelled to operate with extreme discretion, acutely aware that their target commanded a substantial portion of the county's law enforcement resources. They worked out of a borrowed office, maintained paper files instead of digital ones, and communicated via burner phones, constantly cognizant that Michael's allies were ubiquitous. The evidence they meticulously gathered painted a portrait not of a grieving widower, but of a cold-blooded killer and a prolific financial criminal. The pivotal moment arrived with the analysis of the Snyder home's smart speaker, a device Michael had carelessly overlooked in his meticulous cleanup. Forensic experts successfully recovered fragmented audio files from the device's rolling buffer, capturing the final, terrifying moments of Claire Snyder's life. The recording contained the sounds of her pleading with her husband, her voice imbued with a desperate resolve, as she declared she could not allow him to persist in his crimes. Then came Michael's voice, utterly devoid of emotion, followed by muffled sounds that audio experts would later identify as gunshots. Armed with this undeniable evidence, Detective Hughes understood he had to act decisively. The arrest was meticulously planned like a tactical operation, executed at dawn by a team of state troopers, completely bypassing the local sheriff's department. They discovered Michael Snyder in his kitchen, calmly sipping a cup of coffee and perusing the newspaper, which prominently featured a story lauding his tireless efforts to locate his wife's killer. His reaction to the heavily armed troopers bursting into his home was not one of surprise or fear, but of profound, indignant fury. His apprehension wasn't perceived as retribution for his deeds, but rather as a profound personal betrayal by a system he believed was his to command. In the confines of the interrogation room, Michael Snyder exuded an almost theatrical arrogance, a man utterly convinced of his own untouchable status. He faced Detective Hughes, a subtle, condescending smirk playing on his lips, treating the entire process as a mere bothersome formality. With astonishing self-assurance, he denied every accusation, reclining in his chair, effectively challenging the police to substantiate their outlandish theories. He framed himself as the victim of a politically motivated vendetta, a grieving widower persecuted by envious rivals determined to tarnish his pristine reputation. Hughes systematically presented the initial evidence, the inconsistencies in Snyder's timeline, the shoe print precisely matching his boots, and the financial records unequivocally establishing his motive. For every piece of evidence, Michael had an instantaneous excuse, a seemingly plausible falsehood delivered with the slick confidence of someone who had perfected deceit over a lifetime. He scoffed at the financial documents, dismissing them as mere misunderstandings and accounting oversights that his wife, in her agitated state, had misconstrued. He was a master of evasion, deftly redirecting every accusation back onto his interrogators, casting doubt on their competence and underlying motives. The atmosphere in the interrogation room crackled with tension, a silent but fierce battle of wills between the composed, methodical detective and the brazenly arrogant sheriff. Michael's performance was chillingly devoid of emotion. No trace of guilt, no flicker of remorse, merely a deep-seated disdain for the proceedings. He addressed the detectives by their first names, a subtle assertion of his perceived stature, and repeatedly invoked his lengthy and distinguished career in law enforcement. He wasn't merely denying culpability, he was actively ridiculing the very notion that they could hold him accountable. The moment Hughes played the audio from the smart speaker, a palpable shift occurred in the room. For the first time, a fissure appeared in Michael's carefully constructed facade. A brief flash of genuine shock registered in his eyes as he heard his own cold voice and the horrific sounds of the murder. But this shock was swiftly eclipsed by a surge of indignant fury. He slammed his fist on the table, his face reddening profoundly, accusing the detectives of fabricating evidence and employing deepfake technology to frame him. It was a desperate, almost pathetic endeavor to deny the undeniable, a clear indication that his meticulously built world was beginning to unravel. His denials grew increasingly elaborate and unhinged as the interrogation dragged on. He insisted the voice on the recording wasn't his, but that of a professional impersonator hired by his political adversaries. He maintained that the sounds of gunshots were, in fact, a car backfiring, conveniently captured by the device. Each lie surpassed the last in audacity, a stark revelation of his pathological inability to accept responsibility, and his unwavering conviction that he could talk his way out of any predicament. He wasn't just a liar, he was a man who believed his own falsehoods, a narcissist whose reality was whatever he willed it to be. Throughout the protracted hours of questioning, Michael never once shed a tear for his wife. He spoke of her only in the context of her betrayal, framing her discovery of his crimes as an act of disloyalty rather than one of courage. In his warped perception, she was the one who had wronged him. She was the one who had threatened to dismantle the life he had built, and consequently, her death was a direct outcome of her own actions. This chilling absence of empathy was perhaps the most damning evidence of all, offering a stark glimpse into the psyche of a man for whom others were mere tools to be utilized and discarded. The interrogation concluded not with a confession, but with an impasse. Michael Snyder, recognizing the futility of his bluffs, invoked his right to legal counsel and fell silent. His face was a mask of cold fury, but the damage was already done. His arrogant display, his transparent lies, and his utter lack of remorse had been diligently recorded, arming the prosecution with a potent weapon to expose the true character of the man behind the badge to the jury. He had entered that room convinced of his invincibility and departed a murder suspect, his confidence shaken, yet his arrogance stubbornly intact. The news of the sheriff's arrest sent seismic shockwaves through Austin and the broader Texas community. It was a narrative so astonishing it seemed implausible, a spectacular and dramatic fall from grace that defied belief. The city, which prided itself on its eccentricity, now found itself at the epicenter of a disturbingly conventional tale of corruption and murder, a story that would compel its citizens to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters can don familiar guises and wield immense power. The deceiver had played his hand, and now the very system he once commanded was poised to expose his bluff in a court of law. As he was escorted from the interrogation room to a holding cell, Michael Snyder caught a fleeting glimpse of his reflection in the polished glass door. For an instant, he saw not the formidable sheriff, but a desperate man cornered by his own hubris. Yet, the moment passed, and the familiar mask of arrogance recalibrated. He was Michael Snyder, a man seemingly beyond the law. And he was convinced, even as the steel door clanged shut behind him, that this was merely a temporary setback, another impediment to conquer, another fanciful theory to discredit. He still had allies, he still possessed wealth, and he still believed, with every fiber of his being, that he would walk free. With Michael Snyder in custody, the full horrifying extent of his depravity began to emerge, revealing a double life far more sinister than anyone had conceived. The investigation, now unfettered from its clandestine operations, rapidly expanded, bringing to light a portrait of a man who was not merely a killer and a thief, but a profoundly multifaceted monster. Sheriff Michael Snyder, the revered public servant and family man, was a mere facade, a meticulously crafted mask designed to conceal a hidden life of extreme debauchery. Detective Hughes and his team executed a series of search warrants on properties owned by Snyder, including a secluded hunting cabin nestled deep within the Texas Hill Country. It was there that they unearthed the premier tangible evidence of his clandestine world. The cabin was far from a rustic retreat for a lawman to unwind. It was a meticulously organized playground for his darkest urges. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, and the windows were blacked out, creating an environment of absolute isolation and control, a place where screams would go unheard, a sanctuary built for unimaginable cruelty. Inside the cabin, investigators discovered a hidden, climate-controlled room. This chamber was Michael's true office, the nerve center of his criminal enterprises, and the museum of his secret life. One side of the room was dominated by computers and encrypted hard drives containing the intricate details of his financial schemes, a digital chronicle of years of embezzlement, money laundering, and extortion. But it was the other side of the room that rendered even the most seasoned detectives speechless. It was a collection of trophies, personal items meticulously taken from dozens of individuals Michael had victimized throughout the years. These weren't merely mementos of financial conquests. They were artifacts of physical and psychological subjugation. There were driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, and photographs, each item precisely labeled with a date and a cryptic note. Investigators soon grasped that they were examining evidence of a long and prolific career as a predator. The financial crimes were but one facet of his dual existence. He had also leveraged his position of authority to assault, intimidate, and terrorize countless individuals, both within his jurisdiction and beyond. He was not just a corrupt officer, he was a serial predator who wielded his badge as a shield. The inquiry into the financial crimes unveiled a scheme of breathtaking audacity. Michael had established a network of shell corporations, exploiting his extensive knowledge of legal loopholes to funnel millions of dollars of public funds directly into his own coffers. He had rigged county contracts, extorted local business owners, and manipulated evidence in civil cases, all for his personal enrichment. His wife, Claire, had only uncovered the merest tip of the iceberg. The full scope of the fraud was staggering, representing a systematic plunder of the very community he had pledged to protect. As detectives delved deeper, they began connecting the trophies in the cabin to unsolved crimes and cold cases spanning the state. A locket matched the description of one taken during an unsolved assault 5 years prior, A set of car keys belonged to a young woman who had vanished after a traffic stop, her case long since dormant. It became horrifyingly apparent that Claire's murder was not an isolated act of violence, but the desperate action of a man striving to prevent his entire secret world from being exposed. He had killed her, not merely to conceal the fraud, but to hide a lifetime of monstrous deeds. The people of Austin, who had struggled to reconcile the image of their heroic sheriff with the accusation of murder, were now confronted with a truth almost too terrible to comprehend. The local media, which had once extolled him, now ran sensational headlines about the Sheriff of Secrets and the Cabin of Horrors. The city's cherished quirky and vibrant atmosphere was now overshadowed by a dark and sordid reality. The conventional evil that had been festering beneath the surface was now laid bare for all to witness, a stark reminder that the most polished exteriors can often conceal the most rotten cores. Interviews with current and former personnel from Michael's department immediately exposed a pervasive culture of fear and intimidation within the precinct. Many deputies had held long-standing suspicions regarding their sheriff's conduct, believing he lived far beyond his legitimate means and harbored a dark, volatile temperament. Yet, Michael had meticulously cultivated an environment where unwavering loyalty was paramount, and any hint of dissent was brutally quashed. Those bold enough to question him faced swift demotion, forced transfers, or outright expulsion from the department. He had, in essence, transformed his office into a personal dominion, a tool to facilitate his illicit activities and silence his detractors. His partner, Deputy Mark Mitchell, found himself ensnared in a toxic amalgam of guilt and profound cognitive dissonance. For years, he had revered Michael, viewing him as the quintessential embodiment of a law enforcement professional. Now, he was confronted with the horrifying truth that his mentor and confidant was, in fact, a monster. Memories from years past flashed through his mind, each event re-evaluated through this chilling new perspective. The lavish gifts Michael had bestowed upon him, the dubious directives he had obeyed without question, the numerous instances he had conveniently overlooked the sheriff's transgressions. The very bedrock of his career was built upon a lie, and the weight of this realization was utterly crushing him. The prosecution, spearheaded by Eleanor Price, now possessed an overwhelming cache of evidence. Yet they understood that the forthcoming trial would present a monumental challenge. Michael Snyder was a man of immense charisma and manipulative prowess, boasting powerful allies who would spare no effort to discredit the evidence and systematically assassinate the character of his accusers. Price knew her task extended beyond merely proving he was a killer. She had to meticulously dismantle the myth of Michael Snyder, the revered hero cop, and lay bare the depraved reality of the man himself. The revelation of his double life also cast a chilling new light on his demeanor during the interrogation. His palpable arrogance, his disdain for the investigators, and his absolute lack of remorse were not simply the actions of a guilty man attempting to bluster his way out of trouble. Rather, they were the hallmarks of a predator who had operated with such prolonged impunity that he genuinely believed himself to be above the law. He perceived his arrest not as a reckoning, but as a mere inconvenience, a temporary impediment to the life of absolute power and control he had so carefully constructed. As the trial date loomed, the city of Austin held its breath. The case of the state versus Michael Snyder transcended a mere murder trial. It had become a profound referendum on power, corruption, and the very nature of evil. The individual once regarded as the county's most trusted figure was now its most despised villain, a stark symbol of the darkness that can lurk in plain sight. The stage was being meticulously set for a courtroom confrontation that would captivate the nation, destined to write the final chapter in the story of a man who led two lives and the devastating repercussions of their eventual collision. In the months preceding the trial, the Snyder case became a magnet for intense media scrutiny, and Michael, alongside his influential family, strategically capitalized on this attention through a calculated and cynical campaign of intimidation. His family, affluent and powerful Texans with deep political ties, perceived the charges against their son not as a pursuit of justice, but as a public relations crisis demanding immediate management. They immediately launched an offensive, leveraging their status and influence to intimidate prosecutors, taint the potential jury pool, and viciously slander the memory of the woman their son had murdered. This was not a quest for truth. It was an exercise in raw, unapologetic power. The Snyders retained a high-profile, notoriously aggressive defense attorney, a man renowned for his scorched-earth tactics and his adeptness at manipulating media narratives. Together, they instigated a multifaceted war against the prosecution. They funded a series of online articles and television advertisements that portrayed Michael as a decorated hero being unjustly framed by a corrupt district attorney's office. These fabrications, riddled with half-truths and outright falsehoods, painted Detective Hughes as a rogue cop harboring a personal vendetta, and Prosecutor Eleanor Price as an overly ambitious political operator exploiting the case for personal advancement. The most despicable element of their strategy involved the systematic character assassination of Claire Snyder. They leaked fabricated stories to tabloid journalists, suggesting Claire had been embroiled in an affair, was mentally unstable, and had secretly engaged in criminal activities herself. They attempted to cast her as the villain in her own murder narrative, a vindictive woman who had driven her loving husband to the brink. It was a vile and infuriating tactic, a desperate maneuver to sow enough doubt and confusion to obscure the mountain of evidence against their son. Michael himself actively participated in this campaign from behind bars. He granted a series of carefully orchestrated interviews to sympathetic media outlets, performing the role of the grieving, persecuted husband with chilling perfection. He would feign tears, wipe away non-existent moisture from his eyes, and speak in hushed, sorrowful tones about his beloved Claire. However, to anyone who had witnessed the cold, arrogant man in the interrogation room, this performance was transparently false, a nauseating display of narcissistic theater profoundly insulting to his victim's memory. The intimidation tactics extended beyond the media. Key witnesses for the prosecution began receiving anonymous threats, subtle yet unmistakable warnings to reconsider their testimony. One witness discovered their car tires slashed. Another found a dead animal left on their doorstep. While direct culpability could never be proven against the Snyders, the message was unmistakably clear. Testifying against Michael would carry severe consequences. It was a brazen attempt to obstruct justice, a clear indication that the family believed themselves to be above the very laws they were now being forced to confront. Prosecutor Eleanor Price found herself under immense personal and professional pressure. The Snyder family exploited their political connections to initiate an internal investigation into her office, fabricating a frivolous complaint in a transparent bid to have her removed from the case. They hired private investigators to delve into her personal life, scouring for any shred of information they could exploit to discredit her. But Price remained resolute. The more the Snyders pushed, the more unwavering she became. She perceived their tactics not as a display of strength, but as a desperate act. The atmosphere in Austin grew increasingly toxic as the trial date approached. The city, which prided itself on its open and inclusive community, now found itself fractured and divided. The Snyder media campaign had successfully sown seeds of doubt among a segment of the population, and a small but vocal contingent of Michael's supporters began to hold rallies outside the courthouse. They brandished signs proclaiming his innocence and accusing the justice system of corruption, their misguided loyalty a testament to the power of a well-funded propaganda machine. Inside the Travis County Jail, Michael's arrogance only intensified. He treated the guards with contempt, demanded special privileges, and spent his days strategizing with his legal team. He remained convinced that his family's wealth and influence, coupled with his own manipulative charm, would be sufficient to secure his acquittal. He harbored no remorse for his actions, only a burning resentment for those who had dared to hold him accountable. He saw himself as a king temporarily dethroned, already meticulously planning his triumphant return to power. The attempts to weaponize privilege reached an unprecedented low during a pre-trial hearing concerning the admissibility of evidence. Michael's father, a man who had built a real estate empire through ruthless and often unethical means, approached Detective Hughes in the courthouse hallway. He refrained from issuing a direct threat, but his words were laced with a menacing undertone. He spoke of the paramount importance of loyalty and hinted that a man's career could either thrive or be shattered based on the alliances he forged. It was a thinly veiled attempt at witness tampering, an act of such staggering arrogance that it left Hughes momentarily speechless. For Claire Snyder's family, this entire period was a living hell. Not only were they grappling with the crushing loss of their daughter, but they were also forced to endure the public defamation of her character by the very people responsible for her death. They were a quiet, dignified family with no access to the kind of power and influence wielded by the Snyders, and they felt utterly helpless against the relentless onslaught of lies. All they could do was cling to their faith in the justice system and pray that the truth would ultimately prevail. This phase of the case starkly exposed the ugly reality of how immense wealth and status can be shamelessly manipulated to tilt the scales of justice. The Snyders were not merely fighting for their son's freedom. They were fighting to protect their family's name and their entrenched position within the social hierarchy. They perceived the law not as a set of immutable principles, but as a fluid and malleable system that could be bent to their will. Their actions constituted a profound insult to the memory of Claire Snyder and a direct assault on the integrity of the entire legal process. As the jury selection commenced, the battle lines were unequivocally drawn. On one side stood the immense power and influence of the Snyder family, a formidable force willing to employ any means necessary to secure victory. On the other side stood Eleanor Price and her dedicated team, armed with the undeniable truth and an unwavering conviction that no one, not even a powerful sheriff from an affluent family, was above the law. The stage was thus set for a trial that would not only determine Michael Snyder's fate, but also serve as a crucial test of the very soul of the justice system in the burgeoning, tech-savvy city of Austin. The initial day of the trial, a legal spectacle of immense proportions, saw the courtroom overflowing with journalists, members of the public, and the two families tragically divided and seated as warring factions. Michael Snyder, clad in a meticulously chosen, tailored suit designed to exude respectability and gravitas, occupied the defense table with an air of almost serene indifference. Though stripped of his sheriff's badge, he retained the unyielding arrogance of a man convinced of his own command. Proceedings commenced with opening statements, the defense seizing the first opportunity to unleash a vicious and deceitful character assassination of Claire Snyder. Michael's attorney painted her as a volatile and manipulative woman, implying her demise stemmed from her own reckless behavior and dubious associations. Michael was depicted as the long-suffering husband, a man who, in his valiant efforts to rescue his wife from herself, tragically became collateral damage. This intricate narrative aimed to bewilder the jury, to obscure the truth with a deluge of unfounded accusations and innuendo that left one wondering what was real and what was fabricated. Then came the prosecution's turn. Eleanor Price, her face a mask of silent, resolute fury, approached the podium and stood in quiet contemplation, allowing the gravity of the moment to envelop the chamber. She began not with the accused, but with the victim, vividly portraying Claire Snyder as a woman of courage and integrity, a woman murdered for her audacious pursuit of truth. Her gaze then shifted to Michael, and with it, she detonated a bombshell that elicited an audible gasp from the courtroom. Price, for the first time, unveiled the full extent of Michael Snyder's clandestine existence. She declared that this was not merely a case concerning a wife's tragic death at her husband's hands, but rather the story of a serial predator who had terrorized the community with his authority for years. She proclaimed that the prosecution would present evidence of criminal conduct so extensive and appalling that it would fundamentally reshape the jury's understanding of malevolence itself. She wasn't just prosecuting Michael Snyder for murder. She was putting his entire secret life on trial, challenging them to confront a reality far darker than they could have imagined. The defense attorney immediately interjected, accusing Price of prosecutorial misconduct and attempting to unduly influence the jury with irrelevant details. A fierce legal skirmish ensued, but the judge, having already reviewed the overwhelming evidence against Snyder during pre-trial hearings, dismissed the objection. The bombshell had exploded, irrevocably altering the trial's trajectory. For the first time, the confident smirk on Michael Snyder's face faltered, replaced by a flash of raw, unadulterated fury. The prosecution's inaugural witness was Claire Snyder's mother, a fragile yet dignified woman who spoke with quiet, heartbreaking clarity. She recounted her daughter's escalating fear of her husband, her discovery of his financial misdeeds, and her ultimate fateful decision to contact the authorities. Through her tears, she read aloud the last text message from her daughter, a simple yet profound statement. "I have to do the right thing, Mom. I love you." As she spoke, Michael Snyder observed her with chilling detachment, as if she were a character in a play rather than the grieving mother of the woman he had killed. The prosecution then systematically began to present the forensic evidence implicating Michael in the crime. They produced a shoe print from the crime scene, an exact match for the custom-made boots he wore on the night of the murder. They introduced the ballistics report, confirming the bullets that ended Claire's life were fired from his off-duty service weapon. And most damningly, they prepared to play the audio recording from the smart speaker, the undeniable sound of a murder captured by a silent witness in the room. As the audio technician prepared the equipment, Michael's composure began to crumble. He leaned in and whispered something to his lawyer, his expression a mask of pure venom. He knew what was coming, the sound of his own voice sealing his fate. The entire courtroom fell silent as the audio commenced. The mundane sounds of a quiet evening abruptly gave way to a desperate, one-sided argument, followed by muffled pops, sounds everyone in the room recognized as a life being extinguished. Claire's mother let out a strangled sob and had to be escorted from the courtroom. The audio served as the emotional and evidentiary centerpiece of the prosecution's opening. It wasn't merely evidence. It was a window into a woman's final moments, a horrifying testament to her killer's cold, remorseless cruelty. It stripped away all the defense's lies and innuendos, leaving only the stark, brutal truth of what transpired in that room. The jury was visibly shaken, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust. The prosecution's bombshell had achieved its intended effect. It had reframed the narrative, transforming the trial from a straightforward domestic murder case into a sweeping indictment of a corrupt and predatory figure. It had demonstrated to the jury that Claire's murder was not an isolated act of passion, but the logical and inevitable culmination of a lifetime of unchecked arrogance and criminality. It was a bold and audacious strategy, but Eleanor Price understood that to convict a man like Michael Snyder, she had to expose the true monster lurking beneath the facade. As the first day of the trial concluded, the atmosphere in Austin had shifted palpably. The seeds of doubt so carefully sown by the Snyder family had been washed away by a torrent of horrifying disclosures. The public was beginning to grasp the true extent of the sheriff's depravity, and his small contingent of supporters had dwindled, replaced by a growing chorus demanding justice for Claire Snyder and all his other unacknowledged victims. Back in his holding cell, Michael Snyder was no longer the calm, confident figure of that morning. He was a caged animal pacing furiously, his mind racing as he desperately sought an escape from the corner he found himself in. The prosecutor's bombshell had caught him completely off guard. For the first time, he began to realize that his wealth and influence might not be enough to save him, but his fear was swiftly giving way to a profound and enduring rage, a rage he was about to unleash on the very people attempting to bring him to justice. The trial had begun, and the monster, now fully exposed, was poised to demonstrate to the world just how perilous he could be. As the trial entered its second week, the prosecution meticulously continued to build its case, brick by damning brick, constructing an impregnable fortress of evidence around Michael Snyder. Eleanor Price's strategy focused on overwhelming the jury with the sheer quantity and diversity of Michael's crimes, revealing a pattern of behavior so consistent and depraved that his wife's murder would be seen as its sole conceivable outcome. The Austin courtroom, a city that prided itself on its modern, forward-thinking ethos, transformed into a stage for the exhibition of the most ancient and conventional evils. The prosecution's next maneuver was to introduce a piece of evidence that would not only prove Michael's premeditation, but also implicate another individual within his inner circle. They presented a series of text messages exchanged between Michael Snyder and his partner, Deputy Mark Mitchell, during the weeks preceding the murder. These messages provided a chilling chronicle of Michael's escalating fury and his cold, calculated plotting. He had not merely confided in Mitchell, he had used him as a sounding board for his murderous intentions. The text thread commenced with Michael complaining about Claire's discovery of his financial misdeeds, his messages seething with venomous, misogynistic rage. He characterized his wife as a traitor and a snake, articulating the necessity to solve the problem permanently. Mitchell's initial responses were cautious, urging his superior to exercise discretion, but they soon became more compliant, more enabling. He did not alert the authorities. He did not attempt to intervene. Instead, he offered quiet support. His silence and passive agreement a form of complicity that would ultimately render him a key witness for the prosecution. The most incriminating message, dispatched just 2 days before the murder, read, "The problem is going to be taken care of this weekend. She's not going to ruin everything I've built." Mitchell's reply was a single chilling word: "Understood." That solitary word transformed him from a passive observer into an accessory after the fact, a man aware that a murder was imminent and did absolutely nothing to prevent it. When this exchange was displayed on the large screens in the courtroom, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. It was the digital blueprint of a murder plot. This evidence proved devastating for the defense. It utterly demolished their narrative of a spontaneous act of passion, conclusively demonstrating that Michael had been planning his wife's murder for weeks. It also shattered his image as a respected leader, revealing him as a man who would corrupt his own subordinate to serve his malevolent purposes. The jury's gaze shifted from the screen to Michael, their faces etched with a new level of revulsion. They were not merely looking at a killer, they were looking at a master manipulator, a man who poisoned everything he touched. The text messages also served as the foundation for the prosecution's next witness, Deputy Mark Mitchell himself. Confronted with irrefutable evidence of his involvement and offered a plea bargain in exchange for his testimony, Mitchell consented to testify against his former superior. His appearance in the courtroom was a pivotal moment of high drama. He approached the witness stand in his full deputy's uniform, a man visibly consumed by guilt and fear, embodying the collateral damage inflicted by Michael Snyder's reign of terror. Mitchell's testimony was delivered quietly, haltingly, yet it possessed an undeniable power. He recounted his 15-year relationship with Michael, detailing his initial admiration, which gradually gave way to a burgeoning sense of dread and unease. He informed the jury about the sheriff's volatile temper, his monetary obsessions, and his conviction that he was above the law. He spoke of a pervasive culture of intimidation within the department, where questioning the sheriff was tantamount to career sabotage. He was a man admitting his own moral failings, and his shame was palpable. When Prosecutor Price inquired about the text messages, Mitchell's voice faltered. He confessed to knowing Michael's intentions, having had an opportunity to intervene, but being too fear-stricken to do so. He told the jury that Michael wasn't merely his boss, but a man who wielded immense authority over every facet of his existence, capable of destroying him with a single phone call. His testimony painted a vivid portrait of Michael's psychological command over his subordinates, a hold so potent it even extended to complicity and murder. Throughout Mitchell's testimony, Michael Snyder fixed him with a gaze of pure, unadulterated hatred. He was not just angry, he felt personally aggrieved. In his narcissistic worldview, Mitchell's testimony represented the ultimate act of treachery, a demonstration of unforgivable disloyalty. He began to murmur under his breath, his words inaudible to the rest of the courtroom, but strikingly clear to the jury members. He sought to intimidate the witness, asserting his dominance even from the defendant's chair. The judge was compelled to issue a stern warning, informing Michael that another outburst would result in his removal from the courtroom. The cross-examination that followed was brutal. Michael's attorney endeavored to portray Mitchell as a dishonest opportunist, a man willing to fabricate anything the prosecution desired to salvage himself. He assailed Mitchell's character, dredging up a minor disciplinary incident from his past and accusing him of having the true motive to harm Claire. However, this attack backfired spectacularly. Mitchell, who had appeared timid and apprehensive during his direct testimony, discovered a newfound resolve in the face of these accusations. He pushed back, his responses becoming more assured, his voice brimming with the righteous indignation of a man who had finally decided to confront his tormentor. The testimony of Mark Mitchell, coupled with the concrete evidence of the text messages, marked a turning point in the trial. It provided the jury with a crucial piece of the psychological puzzle, a first-hand account of the defendant's toxic and corrupting influence. It revealed that Michael's depravity was not merely a private affair between him and his wife, but a metastasized cancer that had infected the very institution he was charged with leading. The city of Austin was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that for years, their sheriff's department had functioned as the personal instrument of a criminal. For Claire Snyder's family, Mitchell's testimony was a source of both anguish and vindication. It was painful to hear confirmation that their daughter's murder had been preventable, that a man in a position of trust had chosen inaction, Yet it also vindicated Claire's own struggle, confirming that she had been battling a system of corruption far more pervasive than she had ever realized. As the week of damning testimony concluded, the prosecution had successfully constructed an insurmountable wall of evidence. They had presented forensics, audio recordings, financial documents, and now the testimony of a co-conspirator. They had illuminated for the jury the killer, the motive, the premeditation, and the defendant's corrupting influence. The defense was left with the seemingly impossible task of convincing the jury that the mountain of evidence before them was nothing more than an elaborate illusion, a grand conspiracy fabricated to frame an innocent and honorable man. The defense's case commenced not with a counter-narrative, but with a series of frantic and increasingly desperate attempts to sow doubt where none existed. Their strategy was one of calculated chaos, indiscriminately hurling baseless accusations and alternative theories, hoping that anything would resonate. They understood they could not disprove the prosecution's evidence, so they attempted to drown it in a deluge of misinformation. But their entire strategy was destined to collapse when their star alibi witness was exposed as a perjurer on the stand, a moment of courtroom drama that would ultimately seal Michael Snyder's fate. The defense's primary alibi for Michael hinged on the testimony of Frank Carlson, a wealthy real estate developer and a long-standing friend and business associate of the Snyder family. Carlson was prepared to affirm that he had been in a late-night meeting with Michael at the time of the murder, a meeting that had extended for several hours at his downtown Austin office. He was a confident and polished witness, a man who, much like Michael, was accustomed to his words being accepted as infallible truth. His testimony was the cornerstone of the defense's case, the single piece of evidence they believed could exonerate their client. When Carlson took the stand, he delivered his narrative with smooth, practiced ease. He meticulously described the meeting, recalling specific conversational topics, the precise moment he checked his watch, and Michael's exact departure time from his office. He was the quintessential witness for the defense, articulate, credible, and unshakable. He exuded an aura of unimpeachable authority, and for a fleeting moment, a glimmer of hope appeared on the faces of the defense team. They believed they had finally landed a punch, that they had successfully injected the crucial reasonable doubt they so desperately needed. Then it was Eleanor Price's turn for cross-examination. She approached the witness with serene confidence, her initial questions simple and innocuous. She inquired about his extensive business relationship with the Snyder family, subtly establishing the profound financial ties and decades of personal loyalty between them. She then asked him about a particular real estate deal, a lucrative county contract that Carlson's company had secured, a contract personally approved by Sheriff Michael Snyder. The immediate relevance of the question was unclear, but Price was meticulously setting a trap, and Carlson was unknowingly stepping directly into it. The trap was sprung with a single, devastating question. Price asked, "Mr. Carlson, were you aware that your personal assistant, a young woman who has worked for you for over 5 years, is currently in federal custody and has agreed to testify about your involvement in a wide-ranging bid-rigging scheme, a scheme orchestrated by you and your friend Michael Snyder?" The courtroom erupted. The defense attorney leapt to his feet, bellowing objections, but it was too late. The grenade had been rolled into the room, and its pin had been pulled. Carlson's composure shattered instantly. The color drained from his face, and his confident smirk was replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. He stammered, he denied, and he looked desperately towards the defense table for assistance, but none was forthcoming. Price then produced a series of documents, copies of emails exchanged between Carlson and his assistant emails that meticulously detailed the bid-rigging scheme in black and white. She had not merely caught him in a lie, she had exposed him as a fellow criminal, a man with a powerful motive to perjure himself for his co-conspirator. The cross-examination was a masterclass in legal demolition. Price systematically dismantled Carlson's alibi, demonstrating to the jury that his testimony was not merely a favor for a friend, but a calculated act of self-preservation. She then presented irrefutable evidence proving he was not even in his office on the night of the murder. She displayed security footage from his own building's garage footage that clearly showed his car departing hours before the supposed meeting with Michael was ever to take place. She had not simply impeached her witness, She had proven beyond any doubt that he had committed perjury on the stand. As the full weight of his predicament crashed down on him, Frank Carlson crumbled. He began to sob on the witness stand. A pathetic and broken man, his life and reputation destroyed in a matter of minutes. In a final, desperate attempt to salvage himself, he confessed to everything. He admitted that the alibi was a complete fabrication, a story he and Michael had concocted together. He then went even further, confessing that Michael had threatened him, stating that if he did not provide the alibi, Michael would expose his role in the bid-rigging scheme and ensure he spent the remainder of his life in prison. This confession was the final nail in Michael Snyder's coffin. His sole alibi had not only been disproven, his alibi witness had confessed to being threatened by him, painting a picture of a man who utilized intimidation and blackmail as his primary tools of persuasion. It was a moment of such catastrophic failure for the defense that it rendered the remainder of their case utterly irrelevant. They had built their entire strategy on the testimony of a liar, and now that lie had been exposed in the most spectacular and humiliating manner imaginable. Michael Snyder's reaction to this implosion was not one of despair, but of pure, unrestrained fury. He rose from the defense table and began to scream at Carlson, branding him a traitor and a weak, pathetic coward. The previously meticulous facade of the composed, distinguished victim shattered, exposing the seething, savage brute that had long festered beneath the surface. 3 bailiffs wrestled him down, dragging him from the courtroom, his raw shrieks reverberating through the corridor as he was forcibly returned to his cell. Austin, a city that had absorbed the trial with a curious blend of fascination and revulsion, now stood united in its condemnation of the disgraced former sheriff. The sudden collapse of the alibi witness became the lead story across all news channels. The dramatic courtroom unfolding replayed endlessly, cementing Michael Snyder's guilt in the public consciousness. This technically advanced city had served as the backdrop for a time-honored narrative, and now that saga was reaching its inevitable and just resolution. For the defense team, this was a moment of profound professional humiliation. Their client had been unmasked as a perjurer and a tormentor before a global audience, his violent outburst obliterating any lingering doubts about his character. With nothing left to offer, no more witnesses to summon, no further theories to propose. The remainder of their case was a mere formality, a slow, agonizing crawl toward a guilty verdict that was now all but guaranteed. The implosion of the defense's case was a resounding testament to the prosecution's diligent and relentless efforts. Eleanor Price had not merely constructed a case against Michael, she had anticipated his every maneuver, every deception. She understood his reliance on influential connections for salvation and had meticulously prepared for it, masterfully converting his greatest strength into his most devastating vulnerability. The alibi witness, intended as his redeemer, had instead become the architect of his final, irrecoverable damnation. With the defense's strategy in shambles and a guilty verdict virtually assured, the trial transitioned into its poignant concluding phase, the victim impact statements. This segment of the proceedings shifted focus from the cold, sterile language of the law to the raw, human cost of the defendant's transgressions. It was an opportunity for Claire Snyder's family to directly address the court and her murderer, to articulate the profound and irreparable loss they had endured. Yet, what should have been a solemn and respectful occasion devolved into a grotesque charade, orchestrated by the defendant's own monstrous ego. Claire's father began to speak. A retired schoolteacher, a man known for his quiet and gentle demeanor, he visibly struggled to maintain his composure. He approached the podium not with a prepared speech, but with a single small photograph of his daughter taken on her last birthday. He spoke of her profound kindness, her sharp intellect, and her unyielding moral compass. His voice carried no anger, but an overwhelming, bottomless sorrow. The sorrow of a parent forced to confront the unnatural horror of burying their own child. He painted a vivid picture of the immense void left by Claire's death in their family. The empty chair at the dinner table, the grandchildren who would now grow up deprived of their mother's affection. His words, simple yet profoundly heartfelt, were devastatingly effective. He wasn't merely describing a victim. He was resurrecting a daughter, a mother, and a cherished community member, reminding everyone present of the vibrant life so cruelly extinguished. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with a shared sense of grief and empathy. Even the most seasoned journalists in the press gallery were seen discreetly wiping away tears. Throughout this agonizing testimony, Michael Snyder remained at the defense table, displaying an air of profound and insulting boredom. He fastidiously cleaned his fingernails, stifled a theatrically prolonged yawn, and repeatedly glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall, as if impatiently awaiting the conclusion of a tedious meeting. His disrespect was so blatant, so overtly performative, that it felt like a second act of violence, a deliberate twist of the knife in the family's raw, open wound of grief. He was not merely indifferent to their suffering, he was actively contemptuous of it. Then, as Claire's father reached the most emotional crescendo of his statement, his voice cracking as he recounted his final conversation with his daughter, Michael executed an act so profoundly shocking, so utterly devoid of human decency, that it struck the entire courtroom into a momentary, horrified silence. He began to clap. It was not a loud or boisterous display, but a slow, deliberate, and deeply sarcastic applause. Each clap resonated like a gunshot in the hushed room. A twisted, knowing smirk crept across his face as he stared directly at the grieving father, a look of pure, unadulterated sadism in his eyes. The breaking point had been irrevocably crossed. The courtroom, which had been simmering with a quiet fury at Michael's flagrant disrespect, erupted. Claire's brother, a powerfully built man, let out a primal roar of unadulterated rage and lunged toward the defense table, restrained only by the desperate efforts of his family and the court bailiffs. The judge began to slam his gavel, his voice booming as he vociferously demanded order, his face a mask of incandescent fury. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos, a moment where the carefully maintained decorum of the court was utterly shattered by the raw, primal emotions of grief and rage. Michael Snyder, the orchestrator of this pandemonium, simply reclined in his chair, the sardonic smirk still fixed on his face, and observed the chaos he had unleashed. He was clearly savoring it. This was his element, a world of conflict and emotional turmoil that he could effortlessly control and manipulate. He had seized the family's most sacred moment of grief and transformed it into a circus, a chilling testament to his own power to inflict pain and suffering. He was a monster, and this was his final defiant performance. The judge, his face crimson with rage, commanded the bailiffs to remove Michael from the courtroom. As he was forcibly dragged away, still smirking, he cast a look back at Claire's family and mouthed the single silent word. It was his final, pathetic assertion of dominance, the act of a bully who, having lost everything, still clung desperately to his own pathetic sense of superiority. The proceedings were immediately halted, a recess declared to allow emotions to subside and for the sanctity of the court to be restored. This solitary, grotesque act of contempt did more to guarantee a harsh sentence than any piece of evidence or testimony previously presented. It offered a chilling glimpse into the utter blackness of Michael Snyder's soul, a stark demonstration of a man so consumed by his own narcissism that he was utterly incapable of even the most basic forms of human empathy. He had shown the judge, the jury, and the world that he was not merely a killer, but a man who reveled in the suffering of others. The city of Austin, captivated by the trial, was now united in its utter revulsion. The image of the clapping, smirking sheriff was broadcast across every news channel, a visual representation of pure, unadulterated evil. The incident became a haunting symbol of the entire case, a narrative of a man whose arrogance was so profound, so all-consuming, that it had driven him to commit the ultimate act of disrespect in the face of unimaginable grief. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was heavy and somber. The searing fire of the family's rage had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They knew with a certainty that was both comforting and heartbreaking that justice would be served. The man who had snatched their daughter from them had, in his final act of defiance, guaranteed his own destruction. The breaking point had been reached and surpassed, and all that remained was the final, inevitable judgment. The prosecution had already presented a case that was, by any measure, overwhelming. They had irrevocably demonstrated motive, means, and opportunity, and they had systematically dismantled the defendant's character and his flimsy alibi. But Eleanor Price held one final, shocking card to play, a witness whose testimony would not only solidify the case against Michael Snyder, but would also reveal that the murder of his wife was even more sadistic and premeditated than anyone had previously dared to imagine. That witness was Deputy Mark Mitchell, recalled to the stand to testify about a secret he had meticulously kept, a secret that would serve as the final, horrifying revelation of the trial. Mitchell, who had already testified about the incriminating text messages, was visibly terrified as he took the stand for a second time. He had been held in protective custody since his initial appearance, shielded from the wrath of Michael Snyder and his loyal allies. But now he was back, and he had far more to say. Under Price's gentle but firm questioning, he revealed that his complicity in the cover-up had gone far deeper than merely ignoring a few text messages. He had been an active, albeit unwilling, participant in Michael's monstrous plan. Mitchell testified that on the day of the murder, Michael had summoned him into his office for a private meeting. It was here that Michael had meticulously laid out his diabolical plan in chilling, precise detail. He had not merely decided to kill his wife, he had orchestrated the crime like a military operation, complete with a precise timeline, a meticulously manufactured crime scene, and a carefully crafted alibi. He had walked Mitchell through every single step of the plan, not as a confession, but as a rigid set of instructions. He was not just informing his partner, he was assigning him a crucial role. The most sadistic part of the plan, as recounted by a trembling Mitchell, was what Michael intended to do after the murder. He had instructed Mitchell to be the one to discover a key piece of fabricated evidence, a forged suicide note supposedly penned by Claire. The note was meticulously designed to portray her as mentally unstable and to suggest that she had taken her own life after framing Michael for her imagined financial misdeeds. It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty, a plan not only to murder his wife, but to posthumously destroy her reputation and frame her for his own extensive sins. But the plan had gone terribly wrong. Michael, blinded by his hubris, had committed the murder before his fabricated evidence was even in place. When Mitchell arrived at the crime scene, expecting a suicide, he was instead confronted with a brutal and bloody homicide, a crime too visceral to be easily dismissed. It was at that moment, Mitchell later testified, that he realized he couldn't proceed with the wicked scheme. He admitted to being a coward, but emphatically not a monster. He had initially helped secure the scene and even played along with Michael's clumsy burglary narrative, but he steadfastly refused to plant the bogus suicide note. Then came the devastating climax. Eleanor Price presented the court with an audio recording. A secret phone call Mitchell had made to his brother, a lawyer, just hours after the murder. The recording captured a frantic, terrified Mitchell, describing Michael's confession and the diabolical plot to implicate his deceased wife. "He killed her," Mitchell sobbed on the recording. "He told me he was going to kill her, and now he wants me to plant a fake suicide note. He's a monster, and he's going to kill me if I don't help him." This recording served as the ultimate corroboration of Mitchell's testimony, an undeniable piece of evidence caught in the raw, immediate aftermath of the horrific crime. It was the sound of a man's conscience battling his profound fear, a man trapped in an impossible predicament. The jury listened, captivated, their faces a mixture of pity for Mitchell and unadulterated hatred for the man who had entangled him in such a web. The revelation that Michael had planned to frame his wife for his own heinous acts, to tarnish her memory even in death, unequivocally proved his utter depravity. This act of psychological cruelty was so profound, it transcended the physical violence of the murder itself. It exposed a man utterly devoid of morality, with no boundary he wouldn't cross, no act of desecration he wouldn't commit to serve his malignant ego. He didn't just want to escape murder, he sought complete dominance, to utterly destroy and overpower his victim in every conceivable way. This final revelation recontextualized everything the jury had previously heard. His arrogance in the interrogation room, his contemptuous demeanor in court, his sarcastic applause during the victim impact statement, all now made terrifyingly perfect sense. These were not merely the actions of a guilty man, but of a predator who believed he had the right not only to take a life, but to rewrite its very narrative to suit his own twisted agenda. For Claire's family, this testimony was a bittersweet revelation. It was horrifying to uncover the new depths of Michael's cruelty, yet a profound relief to know the world would now see the unvarnished truth of the monster who had stolen their daughter. The fake suicide note, had it been planted, would have been an eternal stain on her memory. Mitchell's 11th hour crisis of conscience had spared them that final, unbearable indignity. As Mark Mitchell stepped down from the witness stand, he was no longer merely a disgraced deputy or a reluctant witness. He was a man who, in the end, had chosen the path of righteousness, however late or imperfectly. His testimony, the final and most damning piece of the puzzle, guaranteed that Michael Snyder would never escape the consequences of his actions. The accomplice's betrayal was complete, and with it, the door to justice, which had seemed so hopelessly barred, was now flung wide open. The jury's deliberation was remarkably swift, a testament to the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence against Michael Snyder. After a mere 2 hours, they returned to the courtroom, their faces grim and resolute. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreman, her hand trembling slightly as she uttered the single fateful word, guilty. A wave of quiet, cathartic relief enveloped one side of the courtroom, while a stunned, angry silence descended upon the other. Michael Snyder, the man who believed himself above the law, was now a convicted murderer, his fate sealed by the very system he had so thoroughly corrupted. As the trial moved into the sentencing phase, the ultimate decision rested with the judge, a seasoned jurist known for his stern demeanor and profound respect for the rule of law. He had presided over the trial with stoic, impartial patience, but everyone in the room recognized that Michael Snyder's monstrous behavior had pushed him to the absolute limits of his judicial restraint. Now, with the verdict delivered, that restraint was about to be unleashed in a blaze of righteous fury. The judge looked down from the bench, his eyes locking onto Michael Snyder, with an intense gaze that seemed to burn. When he spoke, his voice was not the measured, dispassionate tone of a judge, but the raw, thunderous roar of a man forced to bear witness to the absolute worst of human nature. He delivered a blistering 10-minute tirade that would be quoted in newspapers and legal journals for years to come. A moment he abandoned judicial restraint to personally condemn the soulless creature standing before him. "Mr. Snyder," the judge began, his voice dripping with almost palpable contempt. "For weeks, this court has been forced to endure your staggering arrogance, your pathological lies, and your profound, almost inhuman disrespect for the sanctity of human life and the rule of law. You are a cancer on the body of this community, a man who took an oath to protect and serve and use that sacred trust as a shield to hide a lifetime of depravity. You are, without a doubt, one of the most thoroughly evil human beings I have ever had the misfortune of encountering in my 30 years on this bench." The judge continued, his voice rising with each word as he systematically demolished the last pathetic remnants of Michael's ego. He spoke of the betrayal of his badge, the corruption of his subordinates, and the unimaginable cruelty he had shown to the family of the woman he had murdered. "You did not just kill your wife, Mr. Snyder," the judge thundered. "You tried to kill her memory. You tried to poison her legacy with your pathetic, cowardly lies. That, even more than the murder itself, is the true measure of the blackness of your soul." Throughout this verbal evisceration, Michael Snyder stood impassive, a faint, defiant smirk still playing on his lips. But as the judge's words continued to rain down upon him, the smirk began to fade, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. So insulated by his own narcissism, he was genuinely shocked to hear himself described in such stark, unflattering terms. He wasn't accustomed to being judged. He was accustomed to being the judge. The judge then addressed the nature of evil itself, elevating his speech from a condemnation of one man to a broader statement about the perils of unchecked power and the vital importance of holding the powerful accountable. He spoke directly to the people of Austin, the citizens who had placed their trust in the defendant, urging them never again to be blinded by the polished veneer of a charismatic leader, to always question authority, and to remember the hard-won lessons of this horrific case. Finally, he turned back to Michael, his face a mask of cold, unforgiving fury. "It is the sentence of this court," he declared, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "that you, Michael Snyder, shall be confined to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for the remainder of your natural life. There will be no possibility of parole. You will leave this courtroom today, and you will spend every last second of the rest of your miserable existence in a cage, like the animal you are. And may God have mercy on your soul, Because this court has none. The finality of the sentence and the raw, personal fury with which it was delivered finally shattered Michael Snyder's wall of arrogance. As the bailiffs moved to cuff him, his face contorted into a mask of pathetic, self-pitying rage. The man who had mocked the prosecutor, who had applauded a father's grief, who had believed himself a king, was now just another convicted killer, his life reduced to the four cold walls of a prison cell. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, the Snyder family erupted in a furious, undignified outburst. His father screamed threats at the judge. His mother hurled insults at the jury. Their display of impotent rage, a pathetic final act in their campaign of intimidation. They were a family who had always believed their wealth could buy them anything, including justice. They were now forced to confront the one thing their money could not buy: a way out. On the other side of the aisle, there was only a quiet, solemn dignity. Claire Snyder's family did not celebrate. They simply held each other, their tears a mixture of sorrow for their loss and relief that the long, agonizing ordeal was finally over. Justice had been served, not just for Claire, but for every person victimized by the man now being led away in chains. The city of Austin could finally begin to heal, its unique and vibrant spirit now tempered by the hard-won knowledge that even in the most progressive of cities, the battle against the most conventional of evils is a constant and necessary fight.